new series called One Big Story, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is going to be about in just a second. But before we get there, let's talk about the Pixar Theory. So, there is a theory that all Pixar movies, Incredibles, Toy Story, Finding Nemo, WALL-E, the rest of them, all form part of the same universe. It starts with the Will of the Wisps. You've got magic that turns Merida's mother into a bear, and the reason that animals and other things can talk like humans. And it's used by a witch who mysteriously vanishes through wooden doors. That same magic is what leads to the rise of superheroes, so like the Incredibles. And if you've seen the first Incredibles movie, you'll also know about Buddy, who's the villain. And he's behind the rise of AI and the Omnidroid and zero-point energy. And zero-point energy kicks off a machine takeover that we'll come back to in a second. In the meantime, though, it's already starting to affect other things like toys. So, Toy Story. Between Toy Story and what will come later, zero-point energy starts to affect other things. The radiation starts to affect animals. And it starts to lead them to having human-like characteristics, so like in Finding Nemo and Ratatouille. But the animals don't like all the pollution that's being caused. And so down the line there's a big uprising. And because humans have the machines on their side, they win that battle. But the last of the humans after that gets sent off on a ship called Axiom. And down the line, WALL-E saves the human race and allows them to start a new beginning on Earth. And so life starts to bloom again. And I think at the end of WALL-E, I haven't actually seen all of these movies, so I'm completely just going on the Pixar Theory website. But at the end of WALL-E, after the credits, there's a tree that blooms out of a shoe. And that's the same tree that you see in A Bug's Life, and you can start to see life beginning to emerge on Earth. A few thousand years later, things kind of carry on developing, and with the animals become monsters, and the monsters accidentally eradicate humans from the Earth, realizing too late that actually they needed the humans. So with the help of the machines, they decide they work out how to use time travel so that they can get interaction with the humans like they need to through wooden doors. Boo is a character that we meet in Monsters, Inc., which is where we find all these wooden doors. And she learns how to use these doors to time travel and leave some evidence behind in Brave of two wooden carvings, one of a pizza truck and one of the monster Sully, who both of which are two of her favorite things in life. Now, the idea behind the Pixar Theory is that, this is just a fan theory, so you don't have to believe it, but there's something to it. I don't know. I think it's kind of cool. The thing about the Pixar Theory is there are a whole lot of different movies. Each one can stand on its own. You can watch it and you'll have a good time. But the idea is that when you take a step back, you can see how all of these movies are part of the same universe, telling one unified story that when you trace the thread through, you can see how it might all fit together. Over the course of 10 weeks, what I'm hoping to show you is that this might be a fan theory for Pixar movies, but this is a reality for the Bible. That the Bible, although there are a whole lot of different stories with different characters at different times doing different things, it all comes together and we're meant to see it all as one big story. There are threads that we can trace through, that we're going to be doing a lot of, and things that we can see to make the connections, to see how it all fits together. But it isn't just a story we read. It's a story that we live. It isn't just a story. It's our story. It's the world's story. And what I'm hoping that you'll see is that it's your story. And it's a story that begins on page 1 of our Bibles. So let's take a look at the first few chapters of Genesis. You can go to the next slide. I don't think my phone's going to talk to this computer. Bit rude. They were friends earlier. In the beginning, God created the skies and the land. Now the land was wild and waste, and darkness was over the face of the deep waters. Your Bible probably has something like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Same idea. As long as we realize that we don't have a globe in view, ancient Israelites didn't have the concept of a globe. Probably what we should be imagining is just the skies and the land, the up there stuff and the down here stuff. Also, where I said wild and waste, your Bible probably has something like formless and void, or without form and void, or formless and empty, or some version of that. Also fine, the Hebrew there is tohu vavohu, which conveys the idea of being non-functional and uninhabitable. One scholar explains it as being in its not yet state. And it's a watery abyss that hasn't yet been brought to order. Over the course of the chapter, we see this unordered state being brought to order by God. So on days 1 to 3, we've got a whole lot of separating, light from dark, land from sky from sea, land from sea. And then on days 4 to 6, we've got a whole lot of filling. We've got sun, moon, and stars for the skies. We've got birds and fish for the sea and for the skies, and we've got animals of all kinds for the land. And by the end, God looks back and says that it is very good. And on the seventh day, God rested from his work of creation. So what we have is a move from unordered to ordered. We've got to move from not yet completed to being completed, from anti-fruitfulness to being in a state of being conducive to fruitfulness and even abundant in fruitfulness. And the high point comes on day 6 when God says, "Let us make humanity in our image, in our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the skies and over the livestock, over all the land and all the creatures creeping along the ground." And God created humanity in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the land and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the skies, and over every living thing creeping along the ground." All the other animals are created according to their kinds. But humans are created according to God's kind. They're created in his image. The way one writer puts it, humanity is the only item on the entire creation list that has a prototype. God himself. And notice the job that humanity are given. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the land and subdue it, and to rule over the rest of creation. And then in chapter 2, which we didn't read together, but I'd imagine is a relatively familiar story as well. We've got a different creation account, a second creation account. If chapter 1 is talking about the land in general, chapter 2 zones into this part of the land in particular, and how God is going to work through the humans that he placed there to work and to keep it. The woman is created from the man so that they can do this work together. And we have the first recorded marriage in the Bible. And the chapter ends by telling us that the two of them were naked, the man and his wife, but they felt no shame. Things don't stay that way, and this is highlighted by a little bit of wordplay that's going on there in the Hebrew. The man and his wife were arom. They were naked. Then, one verse later, we're introduced to the snake, who is arum. He's crafty. And he tricks them into taking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree that God had told them not to eat from in chapter 2. And things sort of go pear-shaped from there. They realize they're naked, and God kicks them out of the garden. Chapter 4 sort of continues on the theme. So we've got Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel when Abel's offering is accepted and his isn't. He's sent away to the east, where he builds cities. And although cities aren't bad things in and of themselves, the violence that we see later in the chapter kind of puts a contrast between the serenity of the garden that they'd forfeited. It puts that in contrast with these cities that are now being built. One commentator explains that cities are potentially dangerous. If individual sinners are a problem, what happens when sinners congregate together? Well, the answer is obvious. The sin problem is intensified, not solved. Now, even just these 4 chapters raise far too many questions than what we've got time for today. We did a series, my timeline is just completely all over the place. I think it was earlier this year in Genesis. Was it earlier this year or was it end of last year? I think it was this year. Recently. 3 or 4 years ago, we did another series in Genesis, and with both of those series put together and what we're talking about here, we're still not going to scrape the surface. Genesis, there's just so much going on here. There's so many cool things to pick up on, and hopefully we're going to get to look at a few of them. Unfortunately, a lot of questions that do come out of these opening chapters of Genesis have to do with creation, evolution, science, and faith. And I say unfortunately not because they're bad questions, and not because they're not worth asking, but when we spend all our time asking those questions, the questions that we aren't asking are the ones that help us to see how this part of the Bible connects with the rest of the story and actually introduces us to the rest of the story. It isn't just this removed section of the Bible that tells us how we got here and then the real story begins. It's there to introduce the key themes and ideas that the rest of the story is going to be spent developing. So that's one of the things that I'm just hoping that I'll be able to get across this morning, that we'll be able to see that this story is here to show us what is going to unfold as the rest of the Bible story unfolds. The first clue is in Genesis 1 verse 1. God created the skies and the land. Now, two themes that emerge from this opening chapter, from Genesis 1, is land and blessing. The movement from tohu vavohu, from wild and waste, from anti-fruitfulness to a state of being conducive to fruitfulness, of teeming with life, and with God's image bearers responsible for exercising dominion over it, is the movement of that first chapter. And although we'll only be looking at this part next week, I think it would be worth just reading a few verses from Genesis 12, because I think they'll highlight why some of these ideas might be quite important. Genesis 12, 1-3. Yahweh said to Abram, "Go out from your land and your family and your father's household, and into the land which I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation, and I'll bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I'll bless anyone who blesses you, and whoever curses you, I'll curse them. And all people of the ground will be blessed through you." You can see quite prominently those two themes, land and blessing. Right there in Genesis 1. It starts with talking about how the land is meant to be, and that progression from where it's not yet state to being full of abundance and with the blessing that God wants to bring about. Later in the book of Deuteronomy, the nation of Israel, they've spent 40 years wandering the desert. And now they're on the brink of the promised land. They're about to go in. And the desert that they've been wandering around is described as a barren and howling waste, or a tohu and howling waste. Same idea, that tohu vavohu that we see in the beginning of Genesis 1. It's calling that to mind to talk about that wilderness. In the very next verse in Deuteronomy, God is compared to an eagle that hovers over its young, much like the Spirit hovers over the face of the water in Genesis 1 verse 2. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the book of Deuteronomy is constantly referring to the land that the Israelites are about to go into as the good land. And we saw the way that good constantly comes up, this constant refrain through the first chapter of Genesis. I think what we're meant to see, in the beginning, God created the land and the skies, and we're meant to be tuning into this idea of the land, that actually maybe there's something going on here. Actually, maybe there's a particular land that the writer of Genesis wants to draw our attention to. So if Genesis 1 is talking about the promised land in general, the land of Canaan in general, Genesis 2 then zooms in on Jerusalem atop Mount Zion in particular. This is made even more likely when we notice the job that the humans that God has placed there are given to do. So he's in Genesis 2:15, they're told to work and to keep the garden, which is the same instruction that are actually given to the Levite priests. There's a sort of priestly role that's meant to happen here in the garden. And going hand in hand with that is the fact that the way the garden is described is actually a lot like a temple. So the world outside is like the outer court. The general region of Eden is like the holy place. And you've got the garden that's actually in the midst of Eden, the place where the humans and God would meet, like the Holy of Holies. Genesis 1-2 gives us a picture of the ideal, of what it's supposed to look like dwelling in God's presence. Things don't stay ideal. The humans believe the lies of the serpent, and when they do, they realize that they're naked. Not naked and without shame, like in Genesis 2:25. The Hebrew arom. No, this is a different kind of nakedness. This is a shameful nakedness. The Hebrew arom, which is the same word that's used later on in Deuteronomy 28, where the Israelites are told that if they don't remain faithful to the covenant, if they don't remain faithful to God, then a whole lot of curses are going to fall on them. So we read in Deuteronomy 28, 47-48, because you did not serve the Lord, your God, joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity, therefore in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you'll serve the enemies the Lord sends against you. And he'll put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. When God kicks Adam and Eve out of his presence at the end of Genesis 3, it's a picture of exile. It's a picture of God's people getting kicked out of the good land that he's given them to enjoy, and out of his presence, away from the temple where they dwell in his midst. So if that Genesis 1-3, 1-4, maybe even 1-5 is a story of creation, in Genesis 6 we're introduced to a story of decreation and recreation. So you can go to the next slide there. The story is repeated in the second half of the prologue of Genesis. We've noticed already how after being kicked out of the garden, humanity didn't get any better. They made cities and sinned together rather than by themselves. And in chapter 6, we reach an all-time low. So chapter 6, verses 6-8, Yahweh regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So Yahweh said, I will wipe from the face of the land the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. The whole story began, you'll remember, with a watery abyss, which God then brought to order over the course of the 6 days of creation. He planted the humans there in the garden to be part of the order-bringing process. Instead, they've done just the opposite. And so God sends a flood, returning the land to that watery abyss. He kind of turns it on and off. He turns it off and on again. But verse 8, Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. God told Noah to build an ark, and Noah loads up the ark with his family and 2 of each kind of animal, and there's so many connections there that I would love to draw, but we just don't have time. And they wait out the storm. In chapter 8, verse 1, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the land, and the waters receded. And the springs of the deep and the floodgates of heaven had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the skies. I'm going to read that last sentence again because I feel like I got completely lost. And the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the skies. It's actually all the same language as Genesis 1. In 1 verse 2, we have the land, the waters, the deep. And there's a bit of a play on words. The Hebrew word for spirit, who we saw was hovering over the face of the deep in Genesis 1 verse 2, is ruach, which also means wind. And God sent a ruach, he sent a wind over the land in 8 verse 1. We also see the sky from day 2 in the creation accounts. We have the dry ground from day 3, and we could actually keep on going. There are connections with all days of creation here in the flood story. But let's just skip ahead to chapter 9, where we have a pretty obvious connection. God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds of the sky, and on every creature that moves along the ground, and on every fish in the sea. They are given into your hands." They're given the same commission as in Genesis 1, to be fruitful, to multiply, but they aren't told to rule over the rest of creation. They're actually told that the rest of creation will fear the humans. It's a sign that God hasn't given up on humanity. He still wants to work through them to bring about his plans and purposes, but things aren't quite right. We can't just sweep the sin problem under the rug and pretend that everything's okay. And we also have a repeat of the fall story here in Genesis 9. God planted a garden in Genesis 2 verse 8. Noah planted a garden in Genesis 9 verse 20. Adam ate of the fruit of the tree. Noah drank from the fruit of the vine. Cursed is the serpent. Both falls involve nakedness in some way. Cursed is the serpent in Genesis 3:14. Cursed is Canaan in 9 verse 25. We've come full circle. And what happened after the fall in Genesis 3? Well, in Genesis 4, they started building cities so that they could sin together instead of by themselves. Skip ahead to Genesis 11, and that's what we find. God told humanity to fill the earth and to subdue it. Instead, they decided to stay in one place and make a name for themselves. God doesn't like this, so he confuses their languages, and they can't carry on working, so they're forced to scatter all over the place. The result, and I think what would have stuck out to the Israelites reading this first, is that this is a picture of exile. This is a picture of the tragic ending that Israel find themselves in many, many chapters later, which we'll come to down the line. When God kicked the humans out of the garden, they found themselves on the east side of the garden. And here the people moved eastward at the beginning of Genesis 11 to the plain of Shinar. And Shinar was given another name, Babylon, which is where the Israelites would find themselves in exile at the end of 2 Kings. As we wrap up, what I'm hoping that I've been able to show you, even if you didn't take in every detail, even if it felt like a bit of a whirlwind drive-by thing, is that in the beginning chapters of Genesis, we have an introduction to the whole Bible story. That everything else that's going to develop from here on out is there in seed form in these beginning chapters. In a sense, Adam is Israel. And the Bible story is about glorious beginnings, the shame of sin, and the consequences of being sent into exile, and the question of what could make it all okay again. And that's our story too. Each one of us here has been made in God's image. Each one of us here has been made to reflect His likeness and His glory, and to worship and serve Him, and to look after the creation that we've been entrusted with. But we've all turned our backs on God. We all find ourselves in a world that wants nothing to do with Him. And we've had to face the consequences of being alienated from Him. But we also know how the story ends. We also know what could make it all okay again, or rather, who could make it all okay again. Down the line, what we'll see is that, in a sense, Jesus is Israel, and that He humbled Himself to take on human flesh, that He bore the shame of our sin, even though He was completely sinless Himself, and took on Himself the consequences of experiencing exile, of experiencing separation from God, to make all things new, to bring us back to the garden, so that we can enjoy the ideal of living in God's presence once more.